This is the story of the Suez Canal Crisis of 1956, the Troubled Waters. On October 29, 1956, Israeli troops invaded Egypt. Britain and France, who were covertly working with Israel, demanded that both Israel and Egyptian forces be removed from the Suez Canal, which had until recently been under Anglo-French ownership. Earlier in 1956, the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, an anti-imperialist, had nationalized the canal, challenging European control over the region and inspiring the Israeli invasion, which was coordinated with Britain and France. Nasser refused to withdraw his troops from the Suez Canal, providing the British with a reason to attack. British forces bombed Egyptian airfields, escalating the conflict into something with the potential for widespread harm. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Eisenhower was in the middle of a contentious election cycle. The British were confident in U.S. support, but Eisenhower, in a surprising turn of events, decided not to pledge his military assistance. In fact, he condemned the conflict and Britain's actions, which sparked it, and the United Nations calling it a colonialist venture. Eisenhower felt as though he was being forced to choose between Arab nationalism and European colonialism, and all the while the Cold War and the Soviets were on his mind. He knew that a colonialist victory in Egypt would only increase support for the Soviet Union and its communist bloc. So in response, Eisenhower flexed America's economic muscle, putting pressure on the countries involved and effectively halting the fighting in Egypt. On November 5th, 1956, just days after the initial invasion by Israeli forces, Khrushchev threatened a nuclear strike, elevating the conflict to crisis levels. Despite the fact that Khrushchev did not, in fact, have nuclear warheads available, his threat had the appearance of halting the conflict. In reality, economic pressure from the United States had already brought an end to the fighting, but Khrushchev still emerged with the reputation of a strong leader whose dramatic threats of force brought an end to the crisis. It was my goal as the president of Egypt not to get my country involved in this fight between the two superpowers, but the fight for the freedom of Arab people and African people from the hand of European imperialism. I'm sick of our countries being used simply as pawns in their game. I want our people to realize our true potential and become a self-determined nation.
What do you think was the beginning of the crisis?
Well, the real trouble began when I decided to sign an arms deal with Czechoslovakia. After this, the United States and Britain were both trying to appease me with various offers of support for the Aswan High Dam. A dam which I wanted to build, of course, because of the irrigation that it would bring to the Nile. Everything I've done in support of a better future for Egyptians. One of my larger goals was to nationalize the Suez Canal because the British troops stationed there and the company dominating the canal was English and French. I created an agreement with the British that their troops would leave the canal in exchange for Egyptian and British control. They also would have the right to move their troops to the canal if there was any threat to it.
So how did things escalate from there?
I mean, this agreement was in 1954, but then the Americans, of course, withdrew their support from the Aswan High Dam building. I decided to take a chance and attempt to seize the canal and nationalize it because, I mean, it's the best thing for my people. This, of course, upset the British and the French. I've always fought for freedom, so I'm concerned for the freedom of the Palestinians who are being forced into imperialism under the Israelis. So the Israelis sided with the French and British and made a plan together to attempt to undermine me.
As much as any event, the Suez Crisis was a major turning point in the Cold War in Africa. It really was a defining moment, not just for the European countries involved and the superpowers, Britain, France, the US, and the Soviet Union, but for African anti-colonists as well. In some ways, Nasser's actions during the crisis acted as a sort of playbook for future interactions between African nations and the superpowers. mostly with respect to his use of non-aligned positions as an assertive and proactive strategy of exploiting international tensions. For example, the Algerian FLN, or National Liberation Front, similarly exploited the Cold War conflict by allying themselves with the Soviets in order to force out the French. The Suez Crisis had other impacts as well, especially for the superpowers. It made Africa an important battlefield in the Cold War. It demonstrated division in the NATO alliance between the US and European allies, and it shaped Khrushchev's strategy of nuclear diplomacy, which he later exercised during the Cuban Missile Crisis.